Sometimes the hardest winter teaches us what truly matters in life. Sometimes survival means trusting a stranger with more than just your safety. In the frozen mountains of Montana Territory, Miss Eliza Carter is dying alone in her cabin when Boone Walker, a reclusive mountain man, finds her half frozen on the trail. He carries her back to his home, but in a time when a woman's reputation could be destroyed overnight, their situation becomes impossible. There's only one solution that might save her from both the cold and the gossip that could ruin her life. Boone looks into her eyes and asks a question that will change everything. Can you pretend we're married for the winter? But what happens when the snow melts and neither of them wants the pretending to end? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1887 came early to Frost Creek, Montana Territory, and it came with a vengeance that old-timers said they hadn't seen in 30 years. By late November, the mountain passes were already choked with snow, and the narrow valley where the town nestled had become an island unto itself, cut off from the rest of civilization until spring would see fit to release them. Miss Eliza Carter stood at the window of her small cabin on the edge of town, watching the grey sky promise yet another storm. Her breath fogged the glass as she traced a finger along the frost patterns that had formed overnight. Beautiful, she thought, even as the beauty threatened to kill her. The cabin was hardly more than a single room with a sleeping loft, drafty despite her best efforts to seal the gaps between the logs. The pot-bellied stove in the corner fought a losing battle against the cold that seeped through every crack and crevice. She'd been burning through her firewood faster than she'd anticipated, and the stack outside had dwindled to almost nothing. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned back to the meager supplies laid out on her rough-hewn table. 2 tins of beans, a small sack of cornmeal, perhaps 3 cups remaining, a jar of preserves she'd been rationing for weeks, half a salt pork that had seen better days. She'd meant to make the journey into town 3 days ago, but the last storm had kept her trapped inside, and now her supplies had reached a dangerous low. Pride, her mother had always told her, was a dangerous thing. Eliza touched the silver locket at her throat, the one that held the faded photograph of her parents, both long dead now. They'd been Eastern people, educated and refined, and they'd raised their daughter to be the same. But they'd also left her alone in the world at 24, with nothing but her teaching certificate and a stubborn determination to make her own way. That determination had brought her west, to this remote valley where school teachers were desperately needed and few women were willing to come. The Frost Creek School Board had been delighted to hire her, offering a modest salary and this cabin as part of her compensation. For 6 months, she'd been teaching the valley's children, ranchers' sons and daughters who rode in from homesteads scattered across the territory. Hungry for the education she could provide, she'd grown to love them, these frontier children with their rough manners and genuine hearts. Little Emma Hollister, only 6 years old, who struggled with her letters but had a gift for numbers that astonished Eliza. Tom Brennan, 13 and nearly a man, who would rather be working his father's traplines but attended school because his mother insisted. Sarah Chen, whose family ran the general store, bright and curious and dreaming of becoming a doctor someday. But winter had thinned her classroom. The families who lived farthest out had kept their children home once the snows began in earnest. Only the town children and those from the nearest homesteads still made the daily trek. Last week even they had stopped coming. Eliza hadn't seen another soul in 5 days. The isolation was its own kind of cold. She'd known loneliness before, certainly. After her parents died of fever within days of each other, she'd spent a year in Boston, feeling utterly alone, despite being surrounded by people. But this was different. This was the bone-deep knowledge that if something happened to her, if she took ill or injured herself, it might be weeks before anyone noticed. The wind picked up outside. Rattling the shutters, she'd latched tight against the coming storm. Eliza made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. Tomorrow morning, if the weather held even a little, she would make the trek into town. It was only 3 miles, a journey she'd made dozens of times. She'd buy supplies, pay a visit to the Hollisters who lived just past the Mercantile, maybe accept Sarah's mother's standing invitation for tea. She'd be back before dark, her larder restocked, her firewood replenished. It would be fine. It had to be fine. That evening, as the light faded and the temperature dropped further, Eliza prepared for bed with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to conserve every movement, every bit of warmth. She banked the fire carefully, knowing she'd need to rise at least twice in the night to feed it. She heated a stone in the coals and wrapped it in cloth to warm her bed. She put on 2 pairs of wool stockings and her heaviest nightgown, then climbed the ladder to her sleeping loft. From her small window up there, she could see the mountains that ringed the valley, their peaks lost in the darkness. Somewhere up in those mountains, scattered in cabins even more remote than her own, lived the trappers and prospectors who'd chosen to make their lives in the wild places. She'd heard stories about them in town, rough men, mostly some running from pasts they didn't want to discuss, others simply unable to abide the company of their fellow humans for long. One name came up more than others: Boone Walker, the mountain man who lived somewhere up near the high passes, who came into town perhaps 4 times a year to trade his furs and replenish his supplies. The women at the Mercantile spoke of him with a mixture of wariness and pity. He'd been a soldier once, they said, had a wife and lost her, went into the mountains 5 years back and barely came out since. Eliza had never met him, had only glimpsed him once from a distance, a tall figure in buckskins loading a mule train outside the general store, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. She'd felt an odd pull of curiosity about him then, about what would drive a man to choose such solitude. Now, lying in her cold bed and feeling the weight of her own isolation, she thought she might understand a little better. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was fitted with dreams of being lost in snow that fell and never stopped. She woke to silence, the particular kind of silence that means fresh snow has fallen deep in the night, muffling the world. Eliza dressed quickly, layering every warm thing she owned. 2 dresses, both wool, her warmest cloak, a knitted scarf her mother had made years ago, gloves that were beginning to wear through at the fingertips, her good boots, which she'd have to pack carefully with rags to keep her feet from going numb. The sky outside was the color of old iron, and more snow was surely coming. But there was a break in the weather now, a window of a few hours, perhaps. If she moved quickly, if she didn't dawdle, she could make it to town and back. Eliza packed a small bag with the items she hoped to trade, a few jars of her summer berry preserves that she'd been saving, some delicate lacework she'd done by lamplight during the long evenings. It wasn't much, but combined with the small amount of money she had left from her teaching salary, it should be enough. She looked around her cabin one last time, at the neat stack of books on her shelf, at the desk where she prepared her lessons, at the sampler on the wall that read, "Home is where the heart is," in her mother's careful stitching. Then she stepped out into the cold and began walking toward town, unaware that she was walking toward a decision that would change the entire course of her life. The snow was deeper than she'd thought. By the time she'd gone a mile, she was already exhausted, her skirts heavy with accumulated snow, despite her efforts to keep them lifted. The 2nd mile was harder, the wind picking up, the sky growing darker. When she was perhaps halfway through the 3rd mile, still a good distance from town, the storm hit in earnest. It came down like a curtain, thick and blinding, turning the world into a whiteout where she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Eliza tried to keep going, tried to remember the landmarks she'd passed. But everything looked the same now, just endless white and the roar of wind. She didn't realize she'd veered off the trail until she stumbled into a snowdrift that came up to her waist. Panic set in then, real and sharp. She tried to pull herself out, but her strength was already gone, sapped by the cold and the effort of walking through deep snow. Her hands in their worn gloves were numb. Her feet had lost feeling 10 minutes ago. This was how it happened, she realized, with a strange, distant clarity. This was how people died in the wilderness, not dramatically, not fighting some great beast or falling from a cliff, but simply from the cold, from exhaustion, from the implacable indifference of nature to human fragility. Eliza Carter sank into the snow and closed her eyes, and the last conscious thought she had was a hope that someone would eventually find her body and send word to her aunt in Boston. The only family she had left in the world, she did not hear the footsteps crunching through the snow toward her. She did not see the tall figure in buckskins returning from his trap lines, who stopped dead at the sight of a dark shape that shouldn't be there. She did not feel the strong arms that lifted her from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all, or hear the low voice that said, "I've got you. Stay with me now." Boone Walker looked down at the half-frozen woman in his arms and knew that his carefully constructed solitude was about to end. Boone Walker had learned long ago to trust his instincts. They'd kept him alive through 2 years of war, through countless winters in the high country, through the kind of solitude that could drive a weaker man to madness. When those instincts told him something was wrong, on his way back from checking his trap lines, he listened. The storm was coming in fast, and he'd been moving quickly to beat it back to his cabin. He knew these mountains the way some men knew their own gardens, every ridge and valley, every stand of trees and sheltered hollow. He could navigate them in full dark if he had to, though he preferred not to test that particular skill unless necessary. But something made him stop. A break in the pattern of the landscape, a shape that didn't belong. At first, he thought it might be a deer that had succumbed to the cold. It happened sometimes when the winter came on too fast and the herds couldn't migrate in time. Then he got closer and felt his heart kick hard against his ribs. A person. A woman. From the look of the dark skirts half buried in the drift, Boone was moving before conscious thought caught up with action. He reached her in 6 strides, dropping to his knees beside her and brushing snow from her face. Young, he registered, pale as death, lips going blue. But alive. He could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest, could feel the faint pulse at her throat when he stripped off his glove to check. Alive. But not for long if he didn't act fast. He knew the signs of severe cold exposure. He'd seen men die from it during the war, had nearly died from it himself once. She needed warmth, and she needed it immediately. His cabin was perhaps 20 minutes away if he pushed hard. The town was over an hour, and that was in good weather. In this storm, it might as well be on the moon. The decision made itself. Boone gathered her into his arms, hefting her weight easily despite the awkward bulk of her snow-laden skirts. She was small, he thought, lighter than he'd expected. He could feel how cold she was, even through his thick coat, her body heat already dangerously depleted. "I've got you," he said, though she showed no sign of hearing him. "Stay with me now." He turned toward home and started walking, his long legs carrying them both through snow that would have been impassable for most men. The storm intensified around them, wind-driven snow stinging any exposed skin. But Boone kept his head down and kept moving. This was what he was good at. Endurance, survival, the stubborn refusal to yield to the elements. 20 minutes stretched to 30 as the storm worsened. By the time he saw the dark shape of his cabin emerging from the white, his arms were burning and his lungs felt raw from the cold air. But he didn't slow down until he'd kicked open his door and carried his burden inside. The cabin was barely warmer than outside. He'd banked his fire before leaving that morning, not expecting to be gone so long. Boone laid the woman on his bed, the only bed, and immediately set about building up the fire. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, adding kindling and logs until flames leaped high. Only when heat began to fill the single room did he turn his attention back to his unexpected guest. She was still unconscious, which worried him. Worse, when he carefully removed her gloves, he could see the telltale white patches on her fingertips that meant frostbite. Her boots came off next, and he grimaced at the sight of her feet, the same deadly white on several toes. Boone had tended enough injuries in his life to know what needed to be done. But doing it for an unconscious woman he'd never met felt like a violation of something he couldn't quite name. Still, propriety was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. He removed her outer cloak and her wet outer dress, leaving her in her undergarments and a damp inner dress that would have to come off soon as well. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then filled a basin with lukewarm water from his kettle. Too warm too fast could cause as much damage as the cold itself. He had to re-warm her slowly, carefully. He immersed her hands in the water first, watching for any reaction. She stirred slightly, a small moan escaping her blue lips. Good. Pain was good. Pain meant the tissue was still alive. Easy, he murmured, more to himself than to her. I know it hurts. That's how you know you're still here. For the next hour, Boone worked methodically. He re-warmed her hands and feet in stages, gradually increasing the water temperature. He removed the last of her wet clothing, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible, and dressed her in one of his flannel shirts and wool socks. He wrapped her in dry blankets and positioned her close to the fire, but not so close she'd burn. Then he made broth, just simple beef stock with a handful of wild onions, and when she began to show more signs of consciousness, he propped her up and coaxed spoonfuls between her lips. She swallowed reflexively at first, still more asleep than awake. But gradually her eyes began to flutter open, unfocused and confused. Where? The word came out as barely a whisper. Safe, Boone said, keeping his voice low and steady. You're safe. Found you in the snow. Had to bring you here. Her eyes, he saw now, were a deep brown, almost black in the firelight. They moved around the cabin, trying to make sense of her surroundings, then landed on him. He saw the exact moment fear registered. She tried to sit up, to pull away, and he held up his hands in a placating gesture. Easy now. You're hurt. Frostbite on your hands and feet. Need to stay still, stay warm. Who? She coughed, her throat raw from the cold. Who are you? Name's Boone Walker. I live here. Found you on my way back from my trap lines. He watched her process this, saw her eyes widen slightly. The mountain man, so she'd heard of him. Most people in Frost Creek had, though few had ever spoken to him directly. That's right. I need to... She tried to sit up again, and this time Boone did touch her, just a hand on her shoulder to keep her from rising. She flinched at the contact. You need to rest. Storm's getting worse. Can't take you anywhere until it passes, and that might be a few days. The reality of the situation seemed to hit her then. She looked down at herself, at his shirt swamping her small frame, at the blankets wrapped around her. My clothes were wet. Had to get them off you before you froze to death. They're drying by the fire. He stood, putting some distance between them, giving her space. I was proper about it. Much as I could be. She studied him for a long moment, and he found himself oddly uncomfortable under that scrutiny. He wasn't used to being looked at, analyzed. The last 5 years had been about becoming invisible, about not mattering to anyone. I believe you, she said finally, and he felt something in his chest unclench. Thank you. For saving my life. Boone nodded, unsure how to respond to gratitude. What's your name? Eliza Carter. I'm the school teacher in Frost Creek, the school teacher. He'd heard about her. The Eastern woman who'd come west to educate the valley's children. Folks had spoken well of her on his last trip to town. What were you doing out in weather like this, Miss Carter? She looked away, and he saw shame color her pale cheeks. Running low on supplies. Thought I could make it to town and back before the storm hit. That was foolish. Her eyes snapped back to him, a flash of spirit despite her weakened state. I'm aware of that now, thank you. Despite himself, despite everything, Boone felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken back to him with that kind of fire. How long? She swallowed hard. How long will the storm last? He moved to the window, looking out at the wall of white. Hard to say. Could be days. Could be a week. A week. Her voice was hollow. I can't stay here a week. People will. They'll think she didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Boone understood. A young, unmarried woman, spending days alone with a man, in his cabin, in his clothes. The damage to her reputation would be catastrophic. Don't see as we have much choice, he said quietly. Storm doesn't care about propriety. Eliza looked at him, and he saw her struggling with the impossible situation. Finally she closed her eyes and nodded. No, I suppose it doesn't. The wind howled around the cabin, and the fire crackled, and in the silence that followed, both of them felt the weight of what this meant. The storm had trapped them together, two strangers with nothing in common except the will to survive. Boone moved back to the fire, adding another log. "You should rest. Your body needs to heal. Where will you sleep?" "Got a bedroll?" "I'll be fine on the floor. I can't take your bed. You're injured and you're smaller. You need it more." "Not up for debate." She opened her mouth as if to argue further, then seemed to think better of it. Smart woman, he thought. Pick your battles. As night fell and the storm raged on, Boone Walker sat by his fire and tried not to think about the delicate silver locket he'd found around her neck when he'd undressed her, or the way her hands had felt so fragile in his when he'd warmed them back to life, or the fact that his carefully maintained isolation had just been shattered by 100 pounds of stubborn schoolteacher who'd nearly died in his mountains. And Eliza Carter, drifting in and out of feverish sleep, tried not to think about the gentle hands that had saved her, or the low voice that had called her back from the edge of death, or the fact that she was now completely dependent on a man she'd never met, in a situation that could ruin everything she'd worked so hard to build. Outside, the Montana winter howled its indifference to the complications of human hearts and reputations. The storm would last as long as it lasted. What happened after was anyone's guess, but in that moment, in the warmth of a stranger's cabin, with death held at bay by nothing more than fire and will, both of them felt something shift, the first tremor of an avalanche that would reshape the landscape of their lives. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both strange and oddly natural. Eliza's frostbite healed slowly, the white patches on her fingers and toes giving way to angry red, then finally to pink that looked almost normal. The pain lessened day by day, though she still moved carefully, conscious of her body's fragility. Boone proved to be a surprisingly considerate host. He was quiet, yes, and given to long silences that might have been uncomfortable with another person. But there was a gentleness to him that Eliza hadn't expected, the way he made sure she had the warmest blanket, the way he always served her food first, the way he turned his back without being asked when she needed privacy. They fell into a routine. Mornings began with coffee and whatever simple breakfast Boone prepared. Then he would tend to his traps if the weather permitted, while Eliza stayed inside, reading from the small collection of books he kept on a rough shelf, mostly practical volumes about survival and wildlife, but also, surprisingly, a worn copy of Whitman's poetry and a collection of Shakespeare's plays. Afternoons were for chess, or conversation, or the comfortable silence of two people learning to exist in the same space. Evenings meant dinner, more talk, and then the careful choreography of preparing for bed while maintaining what modesty they could. On the 4th morning, Boone returned from checking his nearest trap line with a troubled expression. He stamped the snow from his boots more forcefully than usual and stood by the door for a long moment before speaking. "Saw tracks," he said finally. "Human tracks, coming from the direction of town, then turning back." Eliza felt her stomach drop. "Someone was here." "Close enough. Probably saw the smoke from my chimney, maybe wondered who was staying with me." He pulled off his coat, hung it carefully. "News travels fast in small towns. Then they already know." Eliza's voice was hollow. "They know I'm here with you." Boone moved to the stove, poured himself coffee with hands that were perfectly steady. Most likely, the full weight of her situation crashed over her again. She'd been able to push it aside these past few days to pretend that the world beyond these log walls didn't exist. But it did exist, and it would be waiting for her when she returned. "I'll lose my position," she said quietly. "The school board has a morality clause. I signed it when I accepted the job. Any hint of impropriety—" "I know. You know?" She looked at him sharply. "How could you possibly know what this means for me?" He turned to face her, and his grey eyes were steady. "Because I've been thinking about it for 3 days. Because I'm not a fool, and I understand how the world works, especially for women." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry, not now. "Then you understand that I'm ruined." That everything I came here to build is gone. Not necessarily, she laughed, a bitter sound. What other outcome could there possibly be? Boone set down his cup and came to sit across from her at the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, rough, water-stained, but carefully folded. I've been working on something, he said. A way to protect you. It's not perfect, but it might work. He unfolded the paper, and Eliza saw that he'd written something on it in a careful, slightly awkward hand. She leaned forward to read. It was a marriage proposal. Not a romantic one. It was formal, almost legal in its language, describing a hasty union between Boone Walker and Eliza Carter that had taken place just before the worst of the storms hit. You want us to lie? She asked slowly. I want us to tell a different version of the truth. He leaned back, watching her carefully. We say we met when you came looking for firewood. We say there was an immediate understanding between us, not love necessarily, but respect and recognition. We say we married quickly before the weather turned, because we both knew what was coming. No one will believe that. They might. Stranger things have happened on the frontier. Quick marriages aren't uncommon when circumstances demand it. Eliza stared at the paper, her mind racing. And when spring comes? When the truth inevitably comes out? Does it have to come out? Boone's voice was quiet but intense. Think about it, Eliza. We're already here together. We've already spent days alone. The damage, if there is damage, is already done. But if we're married, even if we say we're married, then there's no scandal. There's just a woman who married a mountain man in a hurry. You're asking me to pretend to be your wife. For the winter, yes. Until spring comes and the pass is clear, and you can return to town as Mrs. Walker instead of Miss Carter. He paused. Unless you'd rather take your chances with the truth. She wanted to argue, wanted to find some flaw in his logic. But the more she thought about it, the more sense it made in a terrible, practical way. A quick frontier marriage was unusual, yes, but not unheard of. And it would explain everything. Her presence here, their time alone together, all of it. What do you get out of this? She asked. Why would you tie yourself to this deception? For the first time, Boone looked uncomfortable. I pulled you out of the snow. That makes you my responsibility. And I won't have your life ruined because I brought you here. There was something else, something unspoken, but Eliza couldn't quite grasp it. She studied his face, this man who was still largely a mystery to her. If we do this, she said slowly, there would have to be rules, boundaries. This would be an arrangement. Nothing more. Agreed. And come spring, we would quietly end it. An annulment, perhaps, or simply a parting of ways, if that's what you want. Eliza looked at the paper again, at the careful words he'd written. It was insane. It was audacious. It was possibly the only thing that might save her future. Can you pretend we're married for the winter? Boone asked quietly, and she heard the echo of her first unconscious moments in his cabin. Had he said something similar then? She took a deep breath. Yes, I can pretend. He nodded once, as if they'd just concluded a business transaction, rather than agreed to a fiction that would bind them together for months. Then we have a story to get straight. If anyone asks, we need to have the details right. They spent the rest of the morning building their fiction. When they'd met, what had drawn them together, how the proposal had happened. Boone suggested they keep it simple, stick as close to the truth as possible, just shifting the timeline. By afternoon, they had a story that felt believable. By evening, Eliza had almost convinced herself it was real. Almost. As she lay in bed that night, listening to Boone's steady breathing from his bedroll on the floor, she wondered what she'd just agreed to, wondered what it would mean to pretend to be someone's wife, wondered what would happen when the pretending became so natural that she forgot it wasn't real. What if someone doesn't believe us? She whispered into the darkness. There was a long pause. Then Boone's voice came back low and certain. Then we make them believe, together and somehow, in the warmth of the cabin, with the Montana winter raging outside. That was enough. January brought the kind of cold that made the earlier storms seem mild by comparison. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes, and even inside the cabin with the fire roaring, frost formed on the walls. Eliza had never experienced cold like this. It was a living thing, aggressive and hungry, searching for any way in. She wore every piece of clothing she owned, wrapped herself in blankets, and still shivered. "Worst cold snap I've seen in 5 years," Boone said, feeding more wood to the fire. His woodpile, once substantial, was dwindling fast. "Should pass in a day or two. We just have to get through it." That night, the temperature dropped further still. Eliza lay in bed, piled with every blanket Boone owned, except the one he'd kept for himself, and couldn't stop shaking. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. From the floor she heard Boone moving. Then his voice, careful and quiet. "Eliza, you need to listen to me. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're shaking so hard the whole cabin's rattling. And if you freeze to death in my bed, people are going to ask uncomfortable questions come spring. Despite everything," she almost laughed. "Is that a J joke?" "Might be. Hard to tell with me sometimes." She heard him stand. "But I'm serious. You need more warmth. Body heat is the best we've got right now." Understanding dawned. "You want to share the bed, just for warmth. I'll stay on top of the blankets, fully dressed. You stay under them. But we need to do this, or you're not going to make it through the night." Eliza knew he was right. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her body was already showing signs of hypothermia. "All right." She felt the bed dip as he climbed in, and then his warmth, glorious, life-saving warmth, surrounded her. He'd kept his word, staying on top of the blankets with his back to her, but even that separation couldn't completely mask the intimacy of two bodies in close quarters. "Better?" he asked after a few minutes. "Much." She'd stopped shivering, or at least the worst of it had passed. "Thank you. Can't have my pretend wife freezing to death. Would ruin the whole story." This time she did laugh, soft and quiet in the darkness. "Is that the only reason?" The question hung between them. Eliza hadn't meant to ask it, but now that she had, she found herself holding her breath for his answer. "No," Boone said finally, his voice low. "That's not the only reason. What's the other reason?" A long silence. Then, because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just pretend. "At least for me." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. "Boone, I know it's not part of the arrangement. I know you're planning to leave come spring, to go back to your life in town. I know this is just survival, just two people trapped together by circumstance." He paused. "But knowing all that doesn't change how I feel." She should say something. Should remind him of their agreement, their boundaries. Should protect both of them from the complications that feelings would bring. Instead, she reached back under the blankets and found his hand, laced her fingers through his. "It's not just you," she whispered. His hand tightened on hers. "Eliza, I tried not to. Tried to keep it practical, keep my distance. But you're—" She struggled for words. "You're the kindest man I've ever met. The strongest. You saved my life, and then you saved my reputation. And somewhere in between, you taught me what it means to truly know another person. We barely know each other. It's been, 6 weeks? 6 weeks of living together, talking every day, sharing everything. Some people could know each other for years and not be as close as we are right now." She felt him shift, turning toward her even with the blankets between them. In the faint glow from the banked fire, she could just make out his features. "What do we do about it?" He asked. "I don't know. Our whole arrangement was built on this ending come spring. Arrangements can change, can they? I'm the school teacher. You're the mountain man. You've built a life away from people. I've built a life centered around community. How would that even work? People have overcome stranger obstacles." Eliza wanted to believe that, wanted to believe they could find a way. But the practical part of her, the part that had survived losing her parents and moving west alone, knew better. Let's just get through winter first," she said. "Like you said that first day, we'll worry about spring when it comes. And if spring comes and neither of us wants the pretending to end, then we'll figure it out together." They lay there in the darkness, hands clasped, and talked through the coldest night of the year. About the future, about the past, about dreams and fears, and all the complicated feelings that had grown between them like vines. Unexpected and impossible to untangle. Eliza learned that Boone had once wanted to be a schoolteacher himself, before the war changed everything. That he loved the mountains not because he hated people, but because he'd been hurt too badly to trust them anymore. Boone learned that Eliza had come west not just for opportunity, but to escape the ghost of her mother's expectations. That she'd always felt like she was playing a role, being the person everyone thought she should be. Until she'd ended up in this cabin and finally felt like herself. Maybe that's what winter is for, Eliza mused, as dawn began to gray the windows. Stripping everything away until all that's left is truth. And what's the truth? Boone asked. She turned her head to look at him, their faces inches apart, with only the thickness of blankets between them. The truth is, I'm not sure I want to go back. The truth is that this cabin feels more like home than anywhere I've lived since my parents died. The truth is, she stopped, not quite brave enough to finish, but Boone finished for her, his voice rough with emotion. The truth is, we're in trouble. Both of us. Yes, she agreed. We certainly are. Outside, the cold began to ease. Inside, surrounded by warmth both physical and emotional, Eliza Carter and Boone Walker acknowledged what they'd both been trying to deny. The pretense had become real, and there was no going back. The morning after the cold snap broke, Boone made the trek down to check the main trail into the valley. He'd been growing increasingly concerned about their supplies. They had enough to last through winter, but barely, and if something went wrong, they'd be in trouble. He returned 3 hours later with a troubled expression and something clutched in his hand. "What is it?" Eliza asked, rising from the chair where she'd been mending one of his shirts. Boone held out his hand. In it was a deputy marshal's badge, and attached to it with string was a note written in cramped handwriting. Eliza took it with trembling fingers and read, "Marshal Collins plans to investigate come first thaw. Thomas Brennan has made formal complaint that Miss Carter was taken against her will. Town council wants answers. Be prepared to defend yourself." "A friend, Thomas Brennan," Eliza said slowly. "That's Tom's older brother. I know who he is." Boone's voice was tight. "He's been courting you, hasn't he?" "Not courting, exactly. He's expressed interest, but I made it clear I wasn't—" She stopped, understanding dawning. "He thinks you abducted me. Or he's using this as an excuse because he's jealous. Either way, we're in trouble." Eliza sank back into the chair, the note still clutched in her hand. This was worse than gossip, worse than rumors. This was an official accusation. "They could charge you with a crime," she said. "They could—" She couldn't finish the thought. Frontier justice was swift and often brutal. Boone paced the small cabin like a caged animal. "The story we planned won't be enough. Not if Thomas is pushing for charges. The marshal's a fair man, but he has to follow the law. Then what do we do?" He stopped pacing and turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a decision already made. "We get married." "For real, legally." Eliza's breath caught. "Boone? Think about it, Eliza. If we're actually married, there's no crime. A man can't abduct his own wife. And if we have a marriage certificate properly recorded, there's nothing Thomas or anyone else can say. But we'd be—" She struggled with the enormity of it. "We'd be bound together, legally. That's not something you just undo when spring comes. I know what marriage means. Do you? Because I'm not sure you've thought this through. You'd be taking on responsibility for a woman you barely know, tying yourself to someone who might leave the first chance she gets, all to protect her reputation and keep yourself out of jail. Is that what you think this is about?" Boone crossed to her in 2 strides, dropped to his knees so they were at eye level. "You think I'm proposing out of obligation, aren't you?" "I'm proposing because the thought of you leaving come spring makes me want to tear this cabin apart with my bare hands. I'm proposing because I wake up every morning grateful you're here and terrified of the day you won't be. I'm proposing because for 5 years I've been dead inside and you brought me back to life." Eliza felt tears stream down her cheeks. "That's not fair." "You can't say things like that. Why not?" Because it makes the decision harder. His hands cupped her face, gentle despite the roughness of his palms. I love you, Eliza. I didn't mean to. Didn't plan on it. But somewhere between pulling you out of the snow and teaching you to read tracks, I fell completely and hopelessly in love with you. Boone, you don't have to say it back. You don't have to feel the same way. But I need you to know, before you make any decision, that this isn't about protection or practicality anymore. If you marry me, you're marrying a man who loves you, who wants to build a life with you, who will spend every day trying to make you happy. She kissed him. It wasn't planned, wasn't thought through. She just leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, and the world narrowed to that single point of contact. He kissed her back with a tenderness that made her heart ache. His hands stayed on her face, holding her like she was something precious, something that might break. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eliza rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for weeks. I just didn't let myself admit it. Then marry me. Really marry me. Not as a pretense or a protection, but because you want to. And if it doesn't work, if we get back to town and reality sets in and we realize this was just proximity and circumstance, then we'll deal with it, together. But I'd rather take that risk than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Eliza pulled back to look at him properly. This man who had saved her life, who had taught her to survive, who had shown her what it meant to be truly known by another person. There would have to be conditions, she said slowly. All right, I need to keep teaching. It matters to me. It's part of who I am. I wouldn't ask you to give that up, and you need to promise not to isolate yourself again. No more hiding from the world. If we do this, we do it as part of the community. He flinched slightly but nodded. That's fair, and she took a breath. And we give ourselves an out. If by summer either of us feels we made a mistake, we can get an annulment. No blame, no anger. We acknowledge it didn't work and move on. Boone was quiet for a long moment. Then, all right, if that's what you need. It's not what I need. It's what we both might need. I won't trap you in a marriage you regret. I could never regret you. You say that now. But feelings change. People change, not mine. Not about you. He stood, pulling her up with him. But I agree to your terms. Come summer, if either of us wants out, we'll end it cleanly. They stood there in the center of the cabin, hands clasped, and Eliza felt the weight of what they were about to do settle over her like a cloak. How do we make it legal? She asked. There's a preacher who travels through the mountain settlements. Old circuit rider named Reverend Thorne. He comes through about once a month, performing marriages and baptisms, taking care of the spiritual needs of folks who live too far from town to attend regular services. When does he come through next? Should be within the week if the weather holds. Boone moved to his shelf and pulled down a small wooden box. He'll need witnesses, but we can probably get the Jenkins family from the next valley over. They're good people, discreet. He opened the box, and Eliza saw a simple gold band inside. Her breath caught. It was my mother's, Boone said quietly. She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to a woman I loved. He took it out, held it up to the light. I gave it to Sarah when we married. Found it after she passed among her things. Kept it because I couldn't let go. Boone, I can't take your first wife's ring. Sarah would want you to have it. She believed in love. Believed in second chances. She'd be happy knowing I found someone else, that I didn't spend my whole life alone. He took Eliza's hand, slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Besides, it's not Sarah's ring anymore. It's yours. Eliza looked down at the band, simple and warm against her skin. When this is over, when the marshal comes and the questions are asked, we could lose everything. My position, your peace, all of it. Then we'll build something new. You make it sound easy. Nothing about this is easy, but it's worth it. You're worth it. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Boone made the trek to find the Jenkins family and explained the situation. Enough of the truth that they'd understand the urgency, not so much that they'd judge. They agreed to serve as witnesses and to spread word to Reverend Thorne when he passed through their homestead. Eliza prepared herself as best she could. She had no proper wedding dress, no family heirlooms to wear. But she had the locket from her mother, and she had Boone's mother's ring, and somehow that felt like enough. Like both their pasts were giving blessing to their future. On the morning of the 5th day, Reverend Thorne arrived with the Jenkins family in tow. He was an ancient man, weathered by decades of mountain living, with kind eyes that missed nothing. He looked between Boone and Eliza, taking in their rough clothing and the small cabin and the obvious love in their expressions, and smiled. "Well," he said, "let's make this official." The ceremony was simple, as frontier weddings tended to be. Reverend Thorne stood before the fireplace with his worn Bible in hand, while Boone and Eliza faced him with the Jenkins family, Benjamin, Martha, and their teenage son Jacob standing as witnesses. Eliza had done her best to make herself presentable. She wore her cleanest dress, had brushed her hair until it shone, and pinned her mother's locket at her throat. Boone had trimmed his beard and tied his hair back with a clean leather cord. They looked, she thought, like what they were. Two frontier people making the best of a difficult situation, except it wasn't just that anymore. Not for either of them. "Marriage," Reverend Thorne began, his voice surprisingly strong for such an elderly man, "is not meant to be entered into lightly. It is a covenant, sacred and binding, that joins two souls into one flesh." He looked at them both with those penetrating eyes. "I've performed many marriages in my years traveling these mountains. Quick unions born of necessity, practical arrangements, marriages of convenience. But I've also seen true love, rare as it might be. The question I always ask is this: are you prepared for what comes after the ceremony?" Eliza felt Boone's hand tighten on hers. "The words I speak today will bind you legally, yes. But the real binding comes in the days and years that follow, in the choosing again and again to stay, in the work of building a life together, in the forgiveness and grace that every marriage requires." He paused. "So I ask you both, are you ready for that work?" "Yes," Boone said firmly. "Yes," Eliza echoed and meant it. The Reverend smiled. "Then let us proceed." He led them through the traditional vows, and Eliza found herself surprised by the emotion that welled up as she repeated the ancient words. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When it came time for Boone to speak his vows, his voice was steady, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I, Boone Walker, take you, Eliza Carter, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, to protect you with everything I have. I promise to build you a home worthy of the woman you are. I promise that you will never face another storm alone." Eliza's own vows came from somewhere deep inside, unplanned but utterly true. "I, Eliza Carter, take you, Boone Walker, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you, to share your burdens, to bring light to your darkness. I promise to build a life with you that honors both who we've been and who we're becoming. I promise that you will never be alone again." Reverend Thorne produced a cord from his pocket, braided leather and cloth, traditional for hand-fasting ceremonies. "This cord represents your binding together. It is ancient tradition, older than the church itself, and I find it fitting for marriages born in these wild places." He wrapped the cord around their joined hands, weaving it in a pattern that Eliza didn't recognize, but somehow understood. It felt right, this physical representation of their joining. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and by God Almighty, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man tear asunder," he grinned. "Boone, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and sweet, mindful of their audience, but Eliza felt its promise. This was real. They were married, truly married, bound together by law and love and choice. The Jenkins family congratulated them warmly, and Martha produced a small cake she'd made and carried carefully through the snow. They shared it with coffee, while Jacob played a few cheerful songs on a battered harmonica he'd brought along. Before the family left, Benjamin pulled Boone aside. Eliza couldn't hear what was said, But she saw Boone nod seriously and shake the other man's hand with evident gratitude. After they'd gone, and it was just the two of them again, the cabin felt different. Smaller somehow, but also more complete. "What did Mr. Jenkins say to you?" Eliza asked. "He said he and his family would testify to the marshal that they witnessed our marriage, that it was freely entered into by both parties, and that anyone who says otherwise is a liar." Boone moved to stand beside her at the window. "Also said he always thought Thomas Brennan was a jealous fool. That's kind of him. Mountain people look after their own." He turned to face her. "And you're one of us now." For better or worse, the weight of it settled over Eliza. Not heavy exactly, but present, real. "What happens now?" "Now we wait. Spring's coming, whether we're ready or not. The marshal will make his way up here as soon as the trail's clear. And we need to be ready with our story, with our proof, with everything." Over the following weeks, they worked to make their story ironclad. Boone retrieved the marriage certificate from Reverend Thorne and placed it in a waterproof pouch with the note that had warned them about the marshal's coming. They rehearsed their timeline, made sure every detail matched, prepared for every question they might face. But more than that, they lived as a married couple, not in pretense anymore, but in truth. Boone moved his bedroll up to the sleeping loft, and they shared the bed as husband and wife. The intimacy that followed was tender and profound. Two people who'd been alone for so long, finally finding home in each other's arms. Eliza learned the landscape of his body, the scars from the war, the calluses from years of hard work, the way he held himself so carefully, as if afraid he might break something precious. She showed him her own vulnerabilities, the fears she'd carried, the loneliness that had driven her west. In the quiet moments after, wrapped in quilts with the fire burning low, they talked about their future with tentative hope. "I could build an addition to the cabin," Boone said one night. "Make it bigger. Add a separate room where you could teach, maybe, if any of the mountain children wanted lessons. You'd do that? I'd do anything for you." He traced patterns on her shoulder with his fingertips. "But I need to ask, are you sure about staying? Really sure? You'd be giving up the town, the school, everything you built there. Would I, though?" Eliza shifted to look at him in the dim light. "What if we found a way to do both? You come to town more often, I spend more time up here. We build a bridge between your world and mine." "That's not how it works. People choose, mountain or town, solitude or society. Maybe people have been choosing wrong." She sat up, excitement building. "Think about it, Boone. You have skills the town needs. Tracking, survival knowledge, understanding of the land. And I have skills the mountain families need. Education, books, a connection to the wider world. What if we created something new? Something that serves both?" He looked at her with wonder. "You really think that's possible?" "I think if anyone can make it work, we can." As February turned to March, the first signs of spring began to appear. The days grew longer. The snow started to melt in earnest. And with each passing day, the tension mounted. Boone taught Eliza to shoot, bringing out a rifle he'd kept carefully maintained. "If anyone asks why you know how to use this, what do you say?" He prompted. "My husband taught me. Said any woman living in the mountains needs to know how to defend herself and hunt for food. And if they ask about your teaching, I plan to continue. My husband supports my work and believes education is important for all children, not just those in town." They drilled the story until it was second nature, until Eliza could almost believe it had happened exactly as they claimed. In a way, it had. They just compressed the timeline and left out the part about the pretense. One evening in late March, Boone came back from checking his trap lines with news. "Saw tracks, horses, multiple riders. They're on their way." The marshal was coming. Eliza felt her stomach twist with nerves. "Are we ready?" "As ready as we'll ever be." He crossed to her, took her hands in his. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I want you to know, these months with you have been the happiest of my life. If we lose everything, if they don't believe us, and we have to start over somewhere else, it will have been worth it. We're not going to lose." Eliza said it with more confidence than she felt. "We have the truth on our side. We're married. We love each other." "That's not a lie." "No," Boone agreed. That's not a lie. That night they held each other close and watched the fire burn down to embers. Outside, spring was awakening. The ice on the creek was breaking up. Birds that had been absent all winter were returning. The world was transforming, shedding its cold shell to reveal new life beneath. Tomorrow would bring the Marshal and Thomas Brennan and questions they'd have to answer. Tomorrow would bring judgment and scrutiny and possibly the end of everything they'd built. But tonight, they were simply Boone and Eliza Walker, husband and wife. Two people who had found each other in the midst of winter and chosen to stay together as spring arrived. "I love you," Eliza whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Boone replied, his arms tightening around her. Always. And in the morning they would face whatever came together, just as they'd promised. They came at mid-morning, when the sun was high enough to make the melting snow sparkle like diamonds. Eliza heard the horses first, the distinctive sound of hooves on wet ground, the jangle of tack and gear. Boone was already moving to the door, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder as he passed. "Remember," he said quietly, "the truth. Just tell them the truth." There were 4 of them. Marshal Collins, a lean man in his 50s with grey at his temples and sharp, assessing eyes. 2 deputies Eliza didn't recognize, young men who sat their horses with the stiffness of those unused to long rides. And Thomas Brennan. Thomas looked different than she remembered from town. Harder somehow. His jaw was set tight, and his eyes, when they landed on her standing in the doorway of Boone's cabin, were full of something that made her step back instinctively. "Marshal," Boone said, his voice level and respectful. "Wasn't expecting company this early in the season." "Mr. Walker." The Marshal dismounted, his movements economical and practiced. "We need to have a conversation." "About Miss Carter here," Mrs. Walker, Boone corrected quietly. "She's my wife." Thomas made a sound of disbelief. The Marshal held up a hand. "That's what we're here to determine." "Mind if we come inside?" "Long ride up from town." Boone stepped aside and the 4 men entered the small cabin. It felt suddenly crowded, the air thick with tension and unspoken accusations. "Mrs. Walker," the Marshal said, turning to Eliza, "I'm going to need to speak with you separately from Mr. Walker here. Standard procedure in cases like this." "Cases like what?" Eliza kept her voice steady, despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Alleged abduction." Thomas spoke for the first time, his voice sharp. "Everyone knows you left town alone that day. Next thing anyone hears, you're supposedly married to a man you'd never even met." "That's not true." Eliza met his eyes directly. "I had met Boone, several times in fact, though we'd never spoken at length." "Eliza, Miss Carter, you can't possibly expect anyone to believe this wasn't coerced." Thomas took a step toward her, and Boone moved to intercept, putting himself between them. "That's close enough." "Brennan, gentlemen," the Marshal's voice cut through the rising tension. "Mrs. Walker, would you be willing to come outside with me? Just to talk. Your husband can stay here with my deputies." It was phrased as a question, but Eliza understood it was really a test. If she refused, if she seemed afraid to be separated from Boone, it would look like she was under his control. "Of course, Marshal. I have nothing to hide." She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and followed him outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. The Marshal led her a short distance from the cabin, far enough for privacy, but close enough that they could still see the door. "I appreciate your cooperation. Mrs. Walker, or do you prefer Miss Carter?" "Mrs. Walker, that's my legal name now." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Can you tell me, in your own words, what happened the day you left Frost Creek?" Eliza had rehearsed this moment 100 times. She took a breath and began. "I was running low on supplies. I thought I could make it to town and back before the storm hit, but I misjudged the weather. Got caught in the blizzard about halfway there. Lost the trail, collapsed in a snowdrift. I would have died if Boone hadn't found me. And how did he happen to find you?" He was returning from checking his trap lines. "Pure chance, or providence, depending on how you see it," the Marshal made notes. "What happened after he found you?" "He brought me here. Treated my frostbite. Saved my life." She met his eyes. "Marshal, I know what Thomas is claiming, but it's not true. Boone didn't abduct me. He rescued me. And the marriage?" This was the delicate part. We had met before, several times when Boone came to town for supplies. There had been an understanding between us. Nothing formal, but a recognition of mutual regard. When he saved my life, when we realized we'd be trapped together for the winter, we both knew what it would look like. What people would say. So, you married to protect your reputation. We married because we cared for each other and because it was the right thing to do. She pulled the marriage certificate from her pocket, where she'd kept it ready. Reverend Thorne performed the ceremony. The Jenkins family witnessed it. It's all legal and proper. The marshal examined the document carefully. This is dated 2 months ago. Yes, early February, after you'd been here for several weeks already. Eliza felt the trap closing. Yes, we wanted to be certain of our feelings before making such a permanent commitment. Or you created this document after you learned I was coming to investigate. No. She kept her voice firm. If you speak to Reverend Thorne, to the Jenkins family, they'll confirm everything. The marriage happened exactly when that certificate says it did. The marshal studied her face for a long moment. Mrs. Walker, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Are you here of your own free will? Yes. Has Mr. Walker harmed you in any way, or threatened you, or coerced you into this marriage? No. Boone has been nothing but kind and respectful. He's treated me with more consideration than any man I've ever known. And if I told you that you could leave right now, you come back to town with us, that we'd protect you and help you end this marriage, would you want to do that? This was it. The moment everything hinged on. Eliza looked back at the cabin, where she could see Boone's silhouette through the window. Her husband, the man she loved. No, Marshal, I wouldn't want to do that. Because I love him and I chose him, and I'm exactly where I want to be. The marshal nodded slowly, making more notes in his book. And your teaching position in Frost Creek? What are your plans for that? I intend to continue teaching, if the school board will have me. My marriage doesn't change my commitment to educating the children of this valley. The school board may have different thoughts on the matter. You signed a morality clause, I'm aware. But I haven't violated it. I married honorably in the sight of God and witnesses. There's nothing immoral about that. Before the marshal could respond, raised voices came from inside the cabin. Both of them turned to see Thomas burst through the door, followed by Boone and the 2 deputies. This is ridiculous. Thomas's face was flushed with anger. You're just going to take her word for it? Take his word? They're obviously lying. Mr. Brennan, I asked you to remain calm. Calm. She was a respectable woman before he got his hands on her. Now look at her, dressed in homespun, living in a shack in the middle of nowhere, pretending to be happy about it. Eliza felt her own anger rise. I'm not pretending anything, Thomas. And you have no right to speak for me or about my choices. Choices? You think you had a choice? He trapped you here, made you dependent on him, and now you think you love him because you don't know any better. That's enough. Boone's voice was low, but dangerous. You don't know anything about what happened here. About what we feel for each other. Thomas wheeled on him. I know you saw an opportunity, and you took it. I know you couldn't get a woman any other way, so you had to find one half frozen and helpless. The punch happened so fast, Eliza almost missed it. One moment Thomas was talking, the next he was on the ground with blood streaming from his nose, and Boone standing over him with his fist still clenched. Boone! No! Eliza rushed forward, grabbing his arm. The deputies had their hands on their weapons, but the marshal held up a hand. Everyone stay calm. Walker, step back, now. Boone did, though Eliza could feel the tension vibrating through him. She kept her hand on his arm, anchoring him. Thomas struggled to his feet, holding his nose. You see? He's violent, dangerous, and you're protecting him. You insulted his wife to his face, the marshal said dryly. I've seen men shot for less in these parts. Consider yourself lucky it was just a punch. He turned to Boone. But that was foolish, Walker. Gives weight to Brennan's accusations. He disrespected her. Boone's voice was still tight with anger. I won't stand for that. Understandable. But control yourself. The marshal looked between them all. Here's what I see. I see a man who saved a woman's life. I see a marriage certificate signed by a legitimate minister and witnessed by respectable people. I see a woman who, when given every opportunity to leave, chooses to stay. I don't see evidence of a crime. Marshal, you can't be serious, Thomas started. I'm very serious. Unless you have actual evidence of coercion or wrongdoing, this investigation is over. These two are legally married. What they do on their own property is their business. The school board can make their own decisions about Mrs. Walker's employment. That's not a legal matter. The marshal tucked his notebook away. Mrs. Walker, you're free to return to town whenever you choose. If you ever need help, if circumstances change, my door is open. But I won't force you to leave your own home. Relief flooded through Eliza so suddenly, her knees almost buckled. Boone's arm came around her waist, steadying her. Thank you, Marshal, she managed. Don't thank me yet. You're going to face questions in town, judgment. People like their neat stories, and yours is complicated. He glanced at Thomas, who was still holding his bleeding nose. Brennan, we're leaving. Deputies, mount up. Thomas looked at Eliza one last time, and she saw the hurt beneath the anger. I would have treated you like a lady, would have given you a proper home, a proper life. Instead you chose this. I chose love, Eliza said quietly. I'm sorry if I hurt you, Thomas, but I chose what was right for me. He shook his head, disgusted or disappointed or both, and stalked toward his horse. The deputies followed, and after a moment, so did the marshal. But Collins paused at his horse, turning back to look at them. One more thing. The Jenkins family did testify to your marriage, just as you said, and Reverend Thorne confirmed the date and circumstances. Your story checks out. He swung into the saddle. But Walker, keep your fists to yourself from now on. Next time I might not be so understanding. Yes, sir. They watched the four riders make their way down the mountain trail until they disappeared into the tree line. Only then did Eliza let out the breath she'd been holding. It's over, she whispered. They believed us. It's really over. Boone pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. She felt him trembling slightly. The adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up with him. I'm sorry for hitting him. When he spoke about you that way, I know. It's all right. She pulled back to look at him, saw the worry in his eyes. We did it, Boone. We survived the winter. We survived the investigation. We can survive anything now. Can we? His voice was uncertain in a way she'd rarely heard. Can we survive what comes next? The town, the gossip, the reality of trying to build a life between two worlds. Eliza took his face in her hands. Yes, because we're not alone anymore. Because we have each other. And that's more than enough. She kissed him there in the spring sunlight, with the snow melting around them and the promise of new beginnings in the air. And for the first time since she'd collapsed in the snow all those months ago, Eliza Carter Walker felt truly, completely free. 2 weeks later, Eliza stood at the door of the Frost Creek schoolhouse with the brass bell in her hand. The same bell she'd rung every morning before winter had changed everything. Her fingers traced the smooth metal, remembering, behind her, she felt Boone's presence. He'd insisted on coming with her for this first day back, though they'd both known he'd draw attention just by being there. But they'd made a promise, no more isolation, no more hiding. They were in this together. Ready? He asked quietly. As I'll ever be. She rang the bell, and the clear sound carried across the valley. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, children began to emerge from the buildings around town. Emma Hollister came first, her face lighting up when she saw Eliza. Then the Chen family's daughter, Sarah. Others followed, some eagerly, some hesitantly, all curious about what had happened to their teacher over the long winter. The parents came too, Eliza noticed, more than usual. They wanted to see for themselves, to measure and judge, and decide whether she was still fit to teach their children. Mrs. Hollister reached the schoolhouse first. She looked at Eliza, then at Boone, standing behind her, then back to Eliza's face. We heard you married, she said carefully. Yes, ma'am. This is my husband, Boone Walker. Boone nodded respectfully. Ma'am. Mrs. Hollister studied them both for a long moment. Then, to Eliza's surprise, she smiled. Well, about time someone civilized that mountain man. Emma, go on inside. Your teacher's waiting. It wasn't universal acceptance. Eliza saw the disapproving looks from some of the other parents, heard the whispered conversations. But it was enough. It was a beginning. That first day back was strange and wonderful. The children were full of questions about where she'd been, what she'd done. Eliza answered honestly. She'd been snowed in, she'd married, she'd learned skills she'd never imagined needing. She taught them about survival in the mountains, about reading weather patterns, about the importance of respecting the wilderness that surrounded them. And at lunch, when some of the older boys asked if Mr. Walker could teach them to track, Boone hesitantly agreed. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Eliza taught in the schoolhouse 3 days a week. The other days, she traveled with Boone to some of the more remote homesteads, teaching children who couldn't make the journey to town regularly. Boone helped with practical skills, tracking, hunting, wilderness survival, while Eliza handled reading, writing, mathematics, and history. It wasn't what either of them had planned. It was better. The school board held a special meeting to discuss Eliza's continued employment. The debate was heated, or so Mrs. Chen reported afterward. But in the end, they voted to keep her on, with the stipulation that she maintain appropriate standards of conduct. As if there's anything inappropriate about a married woman teaching, Eliza had said indignantly when she heard. Boone had just smiled. They're scared of change. Give them time, he was right. Slowly, grudgingly, the town began to accept the unusual arrangement. Boone started coming to town more regularly, trading his furs, helping with community projects. People discovered that the mountain man they'd whispered about was actually thoughtful and skilled and good with children. And Eliza, for her part, discovered that she didn't have to choose between her two worlds. She could be both the educated Eastern woman and the mountain wife. She could teach in a schoolhouse and in a cabin. She could be proper and wild, conventional and free. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Boone took her hand. "I've been thinking," he said. Dangerous habit, he smiled. "Remember the condition you set? That we'd give ourselves until summer, and if either of us wanted out, we could get an annulment?" Eliza's heart stuttered. They hadn't spoken of it in weeks, and she'd almost forgotten. Almost convinced herself it didn't matter anymore. "I remember. Summer's coming soon." "It is." He turned to face her fully. "I don't want an annulment, Eliza. I don't want an out. I want you, for all the seasons to come. I want to build that addition to the cabin. I want to watch you teach our children someday, if we're blessed with any. I want to grow old with you in these mountains." Relief and joy flooded through her in equal measure. "Good, because I don't want an out either. I want all of that. With you, even though I punched Thomas Brennan in front of the marshal. Especially because you punched Thomas Brennan in front of the marshal." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You're mine, Boone Walker. For better or worse. No takebacks. No takebacks," he agreed solemnly. Then ruined the seriousness by kissing her thoroughly. Later that night, lying in their bed, with the window open to let in the spring air, Eliza thought about how far she'd come from that desperate morning when she'd set out for town. She'd thought she was walking toward supplies, toward survival. She hadn't known she was walking toward her future. "What are you thinking?" Boone asked, his arm warm around her waist. "That I almost died in the snow. And instead I found life. Real life, not just existence. I found the same thing. You brought me back from the dead, Eliza, made me want to be part of the world again." She turned in his arms to face him. "We saved each other." "We did." Outside, the Montana night was alive with sounds, owls calling, the creek running high with snowmelt, the wind in the pines. Inside, two people who had been alone were alone no longer. Sometimes the hardest winter teaches us what truly matters in life. Sometimes survival means trusting a stranger with more than just your safety, with your heart, your future, your whole self. Eliza Carter Walker had learned that lesson well. And as spring gave way to summer and summer to fall, and the cycle began again, she would learn it over and over. In the quiet moments and the loud ones, in the easy days and the hard ones. In the life she and Boone built together, log by log, day by day. choice by choice, the pretending had become real. The stranger had become home, and the winter that nearly killed her had instead taught her how to truly live. Some stories end with happily ever after. This one ended with, "We'll figure it out together." And that, Eliza thought, as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, was even better.